Sometimes you have to be honest with yourself and say, I can't just magic well-paid photography work out of nowhere.
How would you advise photographers who want to do what you do and try and earn a living from it?
Have quite a few different pots of earning potential around your practice. Do some teaching, do some mentoring. Always collaborate with other people on some projects.
What would your advice be to someone coming into the industry now?
As an artist, you have to do work that satisfies something within yourself. That has to be the starting point. Another thing of advice I'd give to some creative people is
welcome to the Mood Podcast, uncovering the art of conversation through the lens of photography and creativity, one frame at a time. I'm your host, Matt Jacob. Thank you so much once again for joining me in this week's conversation. My guest today is Ed Sykes, a British photographic artist whose work really pushes the boundaries of what a photograph can be, both materially and metaphorically. With a background that spans many years in news photojournalism, conceptual landscape work, and climate-focused process art, Ed's images aren't just captured, they're constructed, eroded, burned, dissolved, and reimagined. His practice interrogates memory, decay, and deep time, and he's created series where negatives are scorched at 1,000 degrees to mimic climate catastrophe, others where human absence speaks louder than presence. He's also documented queer resistance, UFO mythology, and collapsing coastlines, all while experimenting with plant-based chemistry and slow analog processes. In my chat with him, we explore how Ed's journey from war photography in Somalia to melting film in the darkroom reflects a deep rethinking of what it means to bear witness. We talk about photography as protest, as alchemy, and as a form of remembering, where the material process actually becomes the message. All right, so let's get into it. Here is Ed Sykes. Ed Sykes, welcome to the Mood Podcast. Thank you so much for joining me.
absolute pleasure. Thanks for the invite, Matt.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. Like we're talking about off air, I've been following your work for a good amount of time. I can't remember exactly when and how I found you, but it's almost the beauty of the art world and photography world and just kind of, stumbling upon some incredible artists and then, being lit up by their work and being inspired. So I put that out there without blowing one's trumpet too much. But thank you for being that inspiration. And in my kind of like following of your work, there are lots of kind of quotes that I'm going to touch upon as we talk, but something that really stood out to me, and again, we touched upon this before we went live, but it was the phrase feeling your way through the industry and kind of trying your hand at different areas of the photography industry. So tell us kind of what that means on a personal level to you and experientially how you kind of started in photography, but how you felt your way through the industry to kind of get where you are now.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting phrase, feeling your way through the industry. And to me, part of that is an instinctive thing that you do. So, when you feel as an artist or a photographer that you're comfortable doing what you do, the way that you operate, the people you work with or the people who you photograph, there's got to be you've got to be at ease with yourself and your surroundings. That I think in photography, there's, as in daily life, in the wider world, there's a lot of conflicting things going on. And at times they kind of impinge on your professional world. So, for example, the first thing that I really did sort of professionally was working for a national newspaper in London called The Independent, which had a fantastic reputation for photography, allowing photographers the space to express themselves, maybe more than traditional newspaper photographers would, and then use photographs in a newspaper in a gallery type showcase, as opposed to just a a visual representation of a celebrity or a politician next to a story. But in that example, I would say you're still working within a media organization and essentially the news cycle of a country or the world. And as much as you like to think that you're kind of, whether it's sort of recording the truth or finding something sort of essential to show people through your photography, there are always kind of like other interests impinging on that, whether it's some kind of a political situation you're photographing that, although you, with your own eyes, what you see is your truth, to a certain extent, that situation has been set up before you even got there for a particular kind of viewpoint or agenda or something like that. So
can you elaborate on that a little bit? Like, it's set up in terms of there's the journalist there, there's production there, there's the world's eyes on it. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, or just that, whether it's kind of like a political party has a photo call for something, and it seems to be a sort of have a quite a natural sort of way of showing that to the world. It's it's been thought through beforehand before they've even invited a photographer to be in that space. So
they already have a narrative and they want you to basically photograph that narrative.
And also, I mean, when I was working on a regular basis for a newspaper, you would find yourself repeating sort of the same situation again and again. So maybe, every year you would find the same organization, and, it might be a charity or, I don't know, a sports body or someone who, that needs public funding, that finds a way to visually show themselves to the world, and photographers get invited along, to help. Essentially, you're helping them share their story to the world, and they're trying to, be ahead of another organization in a similar field. And you are, you are repeating that situation. So you might find yourself doing it one year, and then, again, on the diary, a newspaper, they'd say, "Oh, Ed, can you go and cover this story about?" I mean, it could be anything from a species of animal, say, that's being reintroduced to the wild, but they might have done exactly the same thing the previous year, and they're going to do exactly the same thing the year after. So there's a kind of, you start to understand how the media works and how stories sort of get introduced to the world. So I hope, but yeah, in a broader kind of way of responding to that sort of feeling your way through the industry, I would say that I have actually tried a number, whether I've worked in sort of photojournalism or something more corporate, or potentially in something like fashion. I think, the main thread to me as a photographer and feeling your way is actually finding your voice. And I think throughout my career, I've been conscious or always trying to find my voice, whether it's in a slightly different arena of photography. And I think, not everyone is the same. Some people find their voice really early on in their career and just stick with that, and that really works for them. But for me, it's been more of a sort of continual, I was going to say, professional development.
CPD. Yeah. I resonate with that so much. I'm glad you kind of, it's a little bit cliched, isn't it? Finding a voice, but it's true. And I think when I look at your work now, there's so much meaning to it, right? And that's kind of, that is voice, isn't it? You're like, you're creating things and art and metaphors and stories and narratives, all of which actually mean something to you. And if they mean something to you, they likely mean something to other people. And hopefully, certainly if they're politicized or they're topical, then hopefully they mean enough to other people to actually inspire change or something along those lines. So I think that's really, really important. But that's the beauty of it as well, of kind of seeing how everyone's path is so different. I get people asking me all the time, like, I don't really know what to, I love photography, but I don't really know whether to go down this route or this route or this route. But you don't really know until you try it, right? And I think you're a perfect example of that. Like you said, some people know immediately and just go for it. But it's almost like when you get to the point, maybe you, Ed, get to the point of finally finding something that actually really resonated with your inner alignment so much that your voice could come from it. And then you really know, right? It's like, oh, this is what I was meant to do. But I'm kind of almost summarizing this and generalizing it a lot. It obviously wasn't that easy for you. So kind of rewind us a little bit as to how you got, how you started this process, because why journalistic photography? Why photojournalism in the first place? Was it because you had some kind of inner desire to tell stories that mattered?
I've always had an interest in the wider world, and whether that is sort of social issues, politics, the environment. I've always been very aware of sort of what's currently sort of going on around me, and sort of, I was going to say, in those broader circles, whether it's sort of elsewhere in the country that I'm living in or in the wider world. And I suppose that, growing up, I think always has a fairly big influence on you. There are elements of your, teenage years perhaps, or, and the things that I look back on that influenced me to that position that you talk of working for a newspaper and, sort of a journalistic sense. I mean, as a young person, I was really into music. Music was the kind of touchstone of growing up, being a teenager. And in my time, sort of growing up, late 70s, 80s in London, there was the punk movement and then the post-punk movement, and then moving into other areas like, there was always a lot of soul, funk, reggae. It's quite multiracial. There were gigs at the time where you had punk bands playing next to reggae bands on the same bill. And it was like, that was just the way it happened. So, that opens you up to a lot of things going on. There's a thing called the ska movement, which was very much a kind of mixed race, black and white together, but delivering a message. There was always some kind of message that people were trying to get across with their music. So there was that combination of, I would describe as a creative art and some kind of message with perhaps a political undertone. So lyrics were really important. And then, sort of around that time, I was exposed to a lot of sort of nature and the environment. My parents would take us away a lot to the countryside, and complete contrast to my city life. So I kind of had, growing up, these two things going on, this really kind of getting away from everything to this quiet space, and then heading back into the city and, the excitement, the thrill of lots of things going on. So yeah, when I kind of got to introduce, when I went to college in Nottingham. I did a 3-year degree course. And, at that time, there was things like, there was the, the coal strike. The miners were on strike in that area in Nottinghamshire and Yorkshire. And there was this whole kind of dynamic between the sort of strikers and the strike breakers. So it was really visceral, and there would be, support, gigs, fundraising for striking miners. So that sort of thing was always around, and inevitably that was going to be part of my makeup at some point, sort of further along the way. And I went straight from college. I had a break where in college I'm not saying that I enjoyed college, but I found 3 years too long. It was almost like I could have done 2 years and got out into the big wide world.
Yeah.
And I was always frustrated at college that there weren't enough actual working photographers coming in and talking to us about being a photographer. How do you operate? How do you, what's life like for a working photographer? So it felt like a little bit of a bubble, I would say, at college. And so the other extreme was that I went to the States for a couple of years, ended up working on a cruise ship as a photographer on a cruise ship, which was like, not exactly the what I dreamt of doing when I was a student, sort of studying, all the great photographers of the world, and the history of photography. But everything that you do teaches you a lesson, and, you acquire skills that you didn't know you had. You acquire discipline. I think, at a young age, finding the right discipline in how you approach your work and how you operate within certain situations is, you're still developing as a person, and having those people skills, I would say, is always invaluable. You might say, oh, well, I'm not doing photography. I have a job where I'm, I earn money and then I do my photography alongside that. But, you're always kind of acquiring ways of, dealing with situations, dealing with people. And in photography, that's a really important sort of skill to acquire.
But no one teaches that, right? No one teaches really the business side of photography, or the social side of photography, or the networking side of photography, or the marketing side of photography. They teach a lot of technical stuff, a lot of maybe some creative stuff, but that kind of people skills is so important if you're going to make photography a career, or, a full-time art form, isn't it?
Yeah. And circling back to your original question about journalism, how I ended up there, working for a newspaper as well put me then in all sorts of different situations. So, but I had a camera with me. And it, I would be going from like, dealing with government ministers and foreign dignitaries to photographing someone who was a single mother with a baby in a flat with damp, and, real kind of all the way across the board. I was, really interesting people, from actors to film stars to politicians, but then again, doing some really, raw, kind of almost documentary style photography, where you have to earn the trust of people. You don't just walk into a situation and say, hey, I'm a photographer, and everyone just goes, yeah, do what you like. That is, if you do that, you're not going to be a very good photographer or get very good photographs or whatever. So, the good thing about being interested in the world around you, that I've always felt that I have been, is, I've always had time for anyone, whether they're someone you should look up to, or someone who supposedly is not an important person in the world to other people. As far as I'm concerned, I've got time for everyone, and in the same way that they're giving their time to you, but you don't take that for granted. Although, I mean, obviously, you do get some people who will take the piss and, say you've got 20 seconds and you manage to get half a roll of film or, a handful of files, and you say, thank you very much for your time, Mr. Film Star.
So where did this... Well, actually, before I ask the next question, you talked about discipline, and that really kind of pricked my ears up. Can you give us a little bit more of an explanation around those kind of lessons in discipline that you learned at that early age where you are still developing, early 20s, mid 20s? When it comes to photography specifically, what do you mean by discipline?
Well, I mean, very simply, I went from being a kind of arty student to being thrown into a commercial world of cruise ship photography where my earnings were based on commission only. So, I needed to do a good job to earn a living, and there were no ifs or buts about it. There was no kind of, sort of stepping back, looking at my work and sort of scratching my head. So, you knew if you were doing a good job by the sales at the end of the day or the end of the week on the cruise ship. And, where a lot of the work that I did, I was working on daily cruises. So each morning I'd be walking down the gangway to a terminal next to the cruise ship, and there would be, let's say, 700 people waiting to come onto that cruise ship. And it was my job to try and photograph as many of those people next to a sign saying, welcome aboard the Scandinavian Star, as possible. I was probably hungover. It was hot. It was humid. It was Florida. I was wearing some horrible uniform that made me sweat even more. And I had to do my job. So, that was, I would say, being thrown in the deep end. And as much as, in the back of my mind towards the end of it, I resented it. I got disciplined very quickly. B, I earned some money. So, for example, I had some debts from being a student because I was paying for film and paper and also having a social life. So I ended up leaving college with debts, and, I went and
worked your ass off.
I went working and earning and, turning that around. So I'd sort of gone from one extreme to the other. And then the next step was somehow to find that balance, that sweet spot that I guess we all hope to find, which is being paid and the work really kind of, satisfying that urge. Yeah.
The dream. So going to the independent where you had, it sounds like a relatively good balance between structure and freedom. Would that be fair to say, in terms of the projects that you were tasked and assigned?
Yeah, I mean, it was, you were working to deadlines, and, a normal day would be that I would get a couple of assignments, maybe 2 or 3 assignments a day. And most of that work would go into the next day's newspaper. So, there's a certain amount of pressure that goes with that. But there was a mixture of news photography, portraits, features, and, some of it was political, some of it was business people, some of it was art people in the arts, and then, just, real life stories about people and their experiences that might be linked to a particular topic. But yeah,
did you find yourself gravitating? Yeah, did you find yourself gravitating towards a specific style or a specific area of those assignments in terms of whether they're portraits or, the fine arts or whatever it might be?
I mean, I think at college, I'd always been interested in either doing, or at the same time doing portraits and doing more, photojournalist type work. And working at the newspaper, it gave me both of those things really, because, I would get to do portraits of interesting people and also be doing sort of moving news situation work. And that was quite exciting, there was being at a young age and being a news photographer in London was quite a thrilling thing to do when you've got this sort of, you're working against other newspapers, there's a kind of competitive spirit. And then, if you do a really good job, you'll see your photograph on the front page the next day. It was, it was a really great sort of grounding and exciting times. But, things don't always stay the same. And at some point, either you change or the situation you're working in changes and you find yourself moving away from that.
So which one happened with you, and where did this dissonance come from in terms of what you believed in, what you were doing, and what was actually, the reality of it?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose at that age in my early 20s, I had a lot of energy. I was really ambitious. I really wanted to prove myself, get a name for myself, I suppose. And to a certain extent, I was working for The Independent, had a lot of kudos, and I was doing front page news. But, the next stage for me was, well, I want to be seen, in the wider world as a photography. And I thought photojournalism was the natural way to do that. So in those days, there were a lot of stories going on in Europe and beyond. And the natural thing was always to go and cover stories in another country that would get worldwide attention, or, the Holy Grail was to get some of your pictures in the World Press Photo Exhibition, be in the book. So a lot of my contemporaries were doing that type of work. And it was, through that, in the early 90s, I went to Somalia for 3 weeks there was a civil war going on there between warring factions. And then there was, because of that, there was then, there was starvation, and, a lot of the population was suffering malnutrition, and, it was quite a desperate situation. And I went there at the same time that the Americans intervened in the country. So they arrived with their military might to deliver aid. But, the way that the military deliver aid is very different to the way that charities deliver aid. But what it did mean essentially from a, photographic point of view, I managed to get a little bit of money to cover expenses. I went with another photojournalist called Paul Lowe, who had a really good reputation, a fantastic photographer. So we kind of worked together, pooled our resources, and, managed to get an interpreter, a driver, and also you needed to have some bodyguards out there as well, because it was such a dangerous situation. So we traveled around like that. But the situation was that, especially because the Americans were there, it became an international news story around the world. And you had all these photographers almost converging in Mogadishu in Somalia when the Americans arrived. And it just completely opened my eyes up to the way that the international news media works, at that time, but still do to a certain extent. And I found it really difficult, to sort of really come to terms with the way it sort of played out. There were so many photographers and news crews there that, you would turn up to a situation and you would be shoulder to shoulder with another photographer in the same situation. And, I remember that year that in the World Press Photo book that went with the exhibition, there were two photographers who had work in there. And Paul Lowe, who I was with, was one of them. And he had a photograph in color of this young child kind of looking through the hole in this gate of a feeding center. And in the same book, there was another photographer, I think it was Chris Steele Perkins, who was shooting in black and white, because in those days it was on film. And there was a photograph in black and white of this situation and color from a very slightly different angle in the World Press exhibition. And I just sort of thought, well, I might as well have been outside the High Court in London, jostling with another photographer, trying to photograph someone coming out of a court. And here I am in Somalia, shoulder to shoulder with another photojournalist, trying to get the same image. And it just sort of, my whole kind of ambition to be that type of photographer kind of, shriveled away after that whole experience. Not to say that, having, the eyes of the world need to be on difficult situations that go on, but especially at that time, I mean, being in Africa, seeing a white press corps from the Western world descending on an African country felt a very difficult situation to witness. The very few kind of African photographers there, maybe one black photographer and a guy called Dan Eldon, who operated out of Nairobi, who actually, sadly, he was killed in a situation which I think was linked to Black Hawk Down, the film. But yeah, it was a kind of typical kind of, the Western world descends for a couple of weeks to photograph it and then hops on a plane and goes home.
The Western world funded, the photographers and the journalists funded by multi-billion-dollar media companies, who could probably really help solve a lot of those situations.
After that, I went back to London and, obviously started considering what my next step was going to be.
Which was, ding, ding, ding.
Well, essentially, as I said before, that I was doing portraits and photojournalism. It really, portraits became sort of the bedrock of what I did, and working for magazines, and then mixing that with some fashion work as well. But yeah, so working for magazines like, Esquire, GQ, Sunday supplements, the newspaper supplements. It was kind of, I managed to find another balance for a while that sort of satisfied my creativity. But
in that transition, was it more of an existential question that you were asking in terms of photography? Like, is this even something I want to do? Or was you still had that desire and that passion for photography? You just didn't quite know where to aim it still?
Yeah, I mean, definitely I still had the passion and the desire, and, maybe to a certain extent, it's looking back, it's another example of me trying to work through different things, try different things to sort of maybe find eventually where I want to be. And, maybe some people, do those things for 6 months or 12 months and quickly move on. But maybe I sort of had a desire to try it and then prove that I was the best at it before I decided that actually, the question always comes back to me: is this what I want to be doing for the rest of my life? Is this giving me enough beyond that sort of a bit of success, earning money, and getting a bit of approval from my colleagues along the way. So yeah, I guess I've always questioned and challenged myself, which has sort of kept me moving, I suppose.
Yeah, but it depends on at that time. I mean, imagine you were still very young when you were doing your portrait and fashion work for all of these editorial organizations. Was the intent behind that, and you mentioned it, like approval and the word success and to be revered as a photographer, was that kind of overriding or shadowing, should I say, the real kind of intent that you wanted to find with photography in terms of, okay, no, this is really where I want to be forever. Like if I had to do this day in, day out forever, I'd be happy. But was something else shadowing that, or did you believe that at the time? Like, okay, no, I'm in this. I want to do this. Work with these magazines forever.
Yeah, I think at the time I was very much in that headspace. Really quite a narrow focus, I would describe it as. I enjoyed doing it. I loved the challenge of it. I loved meeting interesting people and photographing them, seeing my work in magazines. Yeah, I didn't really sort of see beyond that, but I still think stalking sort of that approach was a need to prove myself. And I think, you mature as a photographer, but you also mature as a person as you age. And those two things kind of side by side, feed off each other, impact each other. So yeah, I would say I was at that stage, I was still in that bubble. And of course, the pressure to earn money, you don't, it was luckily at that juncture, doing editorial photography in London, paid well enough for that to be your way of earning money and creating. And I guess more than anything, I'm fortunate that I was able to do that. It did, that did start to change, I think, which is another example of, not just what's going on inside yourself, but external forces, meaning that you have to adapt your career, your profession as the years pass by, because things change. And, for me, there was a period when I was doing portraits and fashion where some things changed very quickly. One was, there were some of the budgets started shrinking. I mean, another reason why I got out of doing newspapers was that, some of the budgets started shrinking there, and you weren't getting paid that much anyway. I was working like 6-7 days a week. So inevitably I was earning fairly decent money. But when the budget started shrinking, I just thought, this is not the future. It's kind of like, it's not going to bounce back. It's not going to change. And then with magazines, a similar thing started happening. And then there was the change from into digital. And that had a huge impact as well, because I used to shoot on film most of the time.
Yeah, I think and we'll touch upon this, I think, a little bit later, as kind of today's flexibility one has to have with everything that's going on and the speed at which things is moving. But I'm interested in what happened next, almost like what changed, because look at the Ed Sykes of today and you think, oh, you used to work in fashion and editorials, so you wouldn't think that, right? Because it's so different to what you do now. So where did the next transition come from?
Yeah, I think, the transition came slowly. I think it was sort of almost subconsciously in the back of my mind. Something was going on all the time, although I couldn't sort of see it with my own eyes. So I, what I, the thing about fashion that I enjoyed doing when I started doing it, and it's, to a large extent, fashion is a expanded version of portraiture, great portraiture, in one way or another, in the loosest sense. What I really enjoyed about going into fashion was that I was working with other people in a team. So you were working towards a kind of common vision or a goal, working with hair and makeup, a model, but then a fashion stylist, sometimes a creative director or a photography director. And I really enjoyed that collaboration. That was a really nice change from me from being the solo kind of artist, operator, photographer, where everything is sort of comes through your creation, your hands, your vision, whatever. But I enjoyed that idea of bouncing ideas with people. And I'm not saying there was less pressure at all, actually, but it was a different way of working. And, to be honest, I didn't earn much money from fashion because I was never a commercial fashion photographer per se. I did a lot of editorial, which at the time I could earn decent money when I was shooting film because I used to do all my own printing, all my own contact sheets, and I could, charge money at every sort of part of that process to get to the final delivered commission. But then there was the change to digital, which meant I was earning less money as part of that process. I used to love shooting black and white more than color, which is never a commercial kind of option, or is a less commercial option, put it that way. And I did a lot of menswear as opposed to women's wear. So that again kind of puts you in a bit of a sort of limits your options. So I was kind of, but again, I was very ambitious, and, I was working for some cool magazines like ID. There was a magazine called Sleaze Nation. A lot of, Marie Claire I worked for. I was doing some regular stints for Vogue magazine, doing portraits. So, it was interesting, but I wasn't earning much money. And I think in the fashion world, especially, there are kind of various levels that you can achieve or work to. So, but there are sort of these big gaps going from, working for lesser magazines to the biggest magazines to getting, a 1-page kind of commission to a 8-page story. There are these very kind of wide things. So, and it's incredibly competitive. And I sort of had a particular sort of 18 months maybe where I had the opportunity to make that step to getting an agent, to doing more work maybe in New York and Paris as opposed to just to London. And for one reason or another, that never quite happened at that moment where there was potentially, you kind of need and this is another important thing in photography, I think, is having someone who champions your work, having someone who is your cheerleader whether it's a curator, a picture editor, a photography director, editor, whoever it is, having someone like that. And I didn't quite have one of those people on, at my side kind of saying, oh, Ed Sykes is, the next big thing, So that sort of opportunity went. And then I had a meeting with Terry Jones, who was the owner, creative director at ID magazine once. And I showed him an idea for a fashion story. And I'd done some, I wanted to show him a mood board of some pictures that I thought would create a great story for the magazine. And I'd gone somewhere that I thought would be a great backdrop for this story. And he looked through the mood board and the images and sort of looked at me and sort of said, why do you want to be a fashion photographer? Why aren't you a landscape photographer? At the time, I was just like, I was really kind of like, left the meeting a bit. He doesn't like my idea, for this fashion story. I'm a bit off, actually,
Yeah.
The other bit of the, advice conversation didn't really sort of register with me until later on. So obviously, during all that time, when I was doing fashion, and I used to love going to locations and scouting locations, going to the countryside, being in nature, imagining what it would be like at 6 o'clock in the morning, okay, with a model wearing something there, but, something was starting to kind of, tap me on the shoulder and say, do you remember how much, the natural world used to mean something to you?
Interesting. So you had to really dig deep inside and listen to yourself, or as much as you could find inside.
Yeah.
To remember where you really felt the most alive, I guess.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So this is really the kind of the genesis of your voice, I guess, and where you really felt authentic in what you want to photograph. So this was clearly kind of like a slow transition, and then was this where you got a 5.4 camera and started doing large format stuff?
It took me a while because I think basically the thing with fashion is either you're in it or you're not. I mean, you to me, you can't sort of half do it. You have to commit yourself fully. And, I got to the stage where I was doing fashion. I was going, well, I'm not doing any personal work. I wasn't really necessarily thinking of, the environmental nature, but I was just thinking fashion is totally consuming me. I'm not doing anything else. Why is that? And eventually, through all sorts of different reasons, and, with fashion, you can find a lot of cons to the pros, about why or why not, the fashion world is a good thing to be involved with. And all the negatives just outweighed the positives. And I just thought, you know what? It's not what I want to do for the rest of my life. Too many, it's not for me, I'm not that person. It's quite a definite moment of self-reflection. And, I think always one of the questions when you're a photographer that you should be asking yourself, if it's something that you really want to do, that you think is the way forward, is the future, is, can you imagine getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning to go somewhere? I don't know, it might be, you might have to walk, you might have to drive, and a couple of hours later, hoping to get one photograph, but you might not even get it, and having to go home and do it all over again. Is it worth it? When you do that, does that image or does that subject matter mean enough to you? And if it doesn't mean enough to you to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and do it, then, the answer is there really. So, I went through that sort of period about trying to understand myself more and thinking, what is it that I care about? Does it involve photography? Do I still want to carry on being a photographer? I guess I went through what you would describe as a, professional, what's the word? When you have a sort of break, sabbatical. Yeah. I kind of, mentally, I had a sabbatical from photography.
Okay.
I've always kind of gone to exhibitions and looked at other art and been interested in creativity. So that didn't stop. But, I had to ask myself some basic questions. Do I want to carry on doing photography? What type of photography do I want to do? And how do I want to do it? Let's sweep it all away. Everything you've done, you've got a blank canvas. What does it look like to you? And that essentially involved me buying a large format camera and going back into the landscape and doing that.
And this is this is where the environmental kind of undertones started to form, or was the environmental consciousness always something that was there? You just didn't really pay much attention to it, or how did this kind of emanate?
No, I mean, the environmental issues have always been there for me. Whether it's, I remember when I was very young, in 1986 or 1987, when the Chernobyl nuclear reactor went into meltdown in the late 80s. I remember that vividly when I was young, as that was an environmental catastrophe. And that, I'm not saying that, ever since then but I remember that. I've always remembered that. And, along the way, I've always been interested in, climate agreements, understanding when the CFCs were banned that were creating a hole over the Arctic, and, the international agreements that came to ban CFCs because of the harm that they did. I remember all the coverage of acid rain, which was a big issue as well. And then all the kind of climate agreements that, when the US didn't sign up to them with George Bush. And so, I've always, that has been there. But that doesn't always necessarily translate into, it being something that you find a creative outlet for. But yeah, my interest in it was at a high level. And I think, definitely had to be to, move forward.
Absolutely. And so at this point then, when you're kind of making this, okay, it wasn't an overnight decision, but you looked inward a lot and you decided to, go down this path. One of the biggest concerns must have been, well, how the do I earn money from this, right? You're coming from, a revenue stream that's pretty reliable in terms of the fashion and editorial work that you're doing. Now you're kind of shifting gears. How did you figure that out?
I'd always managed sort of throughout these transitions to have some regular clients.
Okay.
Whether they're sort of in the design industry. So kind of not quite advertising agencies, but sort of below the level of advertising agencies, design agencies that produce material. So that kept me going for a while and was quite well paid. But eventually, that industry kind of shriveled as well, due to various sort of circumstances. It was a very lucrative thing for photojournalist type photographers for a while, producing yearly brochures for big companies. So whether a whiskey company or whoever it might be would ask a photojournalist or a photographer to come in, produce images for an annual report. Then annual reports weren't a legal necessity anymore in the same way. So that was something that changed. But yeah, I had to, it came to the point because I needed to, I had a family and I needed to pay the mortgage, pay the rent. And I had a couple of part-time jobs away from photography because I just, sometimes you have to be honest with yourself and say, look, I can't just magic well-paid photography work out of nowhere. And, looking at the way the market was going, it was kind of, well, I could put a huge amount of effort into getting clients in that particular sector, but I can see that sector is not expanding. Wherever I was looking, everything photographically, budget-wise, whatever, was shrinking, and it was a real challenge. So I thought, okay, well, keep doing the photography that I enjoy doing, find some paid work, whatever it is. So basically since then, I've always had a side hustle or a kind of paid job in some shape or form. And sometimes that involves photography, it involves film, but it's a constantly evolving thing. I was, up until last year, I was doing corporate photography and films, working alongside a friend of mine. And, that market has changed quite considerably. Now there's, content, social media content, any kind of moving image content is, done on a smartphone, and it's done by the marketing team in a big company. They look at their budget and go, why are we spending thousands of pounds on a couple of people to come in to do this when we can do it ourselves, or even like we can use that old footage and it'll keep us going for 5 years before we, yeah. So, yeah, I mean, back to my current circumstances, I'm at the moment doing a part-time working for an fine art restoration company. So they deal with, in a strange, ironic sort of turnaround, they work with a lot of insurers who have clients whose artwork has been damaged by flood or by fire and need their artworks restored. So
they haven't got hold of some of yours, have they? From 1,000 degrees and hanging by.
I mean, I could always add fire and water to anyone's image.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's quite a strange one to be part of. But it's I occasionally do photography as part of that. I have to document some of the damaged works. I have to build the buildings, the environment, and it's it's varied, and it's sort of I get to see some amazing artwork. So, but yeah, that's my sort of side hustle alongside my other, alongside the photography, which I try to monetize as well. So yeah.
Well, without asking you how you monetize things specifically, but how would you advise photographers who want to do what you do or go into this area of the photography industry and try and earn a living from it? How would you suggest that we monetize our our personal work for a start, as well as, obviously going to get some maybe commercial work or other professional work that we can. But, what would your advice be to someone coming into the industry now, or would just be don't?
Okay. I would never say don't, I would always encourage and support people who want to follow that path. But, do so with eyes wide open, be honest. Don't sell, an unachievable dream that doesn't exist anymore. So, yeah, I always try and be honest. I think one of the main things I would say is have quite a few different pots of earning potential around your practice. And all of those things, even if the money is not all from selling your own work specifically, what you do around it is building your other people's awareness of you, your brand, your vision, what you bring to the table as a person, as an artist, and how you interact with people generally. I think so. If you want to be someone who has those plates spinning, I'd say do some teaching, do some mentoring, always collaborate with other people on some projects. You never know where they might lead. If you're really passionate about something and you like a group of people, I'm not saying do it a lot, because I think you should never offer to do anything for nothing. But if you see people operating and giving their services who are really creative people to a particular cause that you believe in, join them. You never know where it might build to. But, that should always be at the back of the queue behind other stuff that, sort of has an obvious way of being paid. Sell your prints, sell your work, have an archive. You never know when people might be interested in a very niche topic that you photographed or a niche location. And, you can sort of find that you've got a very particular sort of market to sell to because of that. So always keep that in mind. Sort of beyond, commissioned work, and that can be, that can just be through, I suppose that links to selling prints and as well, and widening your network. I think networks and networking is incredibly important, and that's one of the things that I would say one of the biggest changes in I would say call it professional development. But when I was a photographer in my first 10, 20 years potentially, I very much saw myself as a kind of, as a lone gun. It was just me against the world, and I was going to prove myself, and it was just going to be through my amazing work that everything would fall into my lap. My approach these days is very different, and I like networking. I like meeting people. I like meeting fellow artists. I like to collaborate with other artists, maybe have, be involved in group exhibitions, not just think about my solo work. And just be out there and be interested in stuff, and, talk to other people and bounce ideas around, whether it's to do with a particular subject matter that you're interested in and they're interested in, or, it might even boil down to a particularly new sort of creative technique that you've discovered that you're obsessed with, and you find some other people who are obsessed by it. I mean, that can just be a really fun thing to become involved in. So, I would say I'm a lot looser in my kind of approach these days, and open to other ways of kind of doing things. But I'm not going to say it's all easy keeping all of those plates spinning, and then having another skill. God, if you do have another skill, and if you're great at fixing cars, fix some cars at the weekend and earn some great money.
Yeah.
There are some things that people will always need, someone around to help with and pay them. So if you've got a skill, no shame in, using that as well. And the other thing, that I would say is it can be really important to that other thing that you do that earns money, if it doesn't involve something that you think is creative or photographic, it gives you an opportunity to step away from that intensity that you put into your own work and your own practice. And I think increasingly finding some headspace is really important.
Perspective. Yeah. I think it actually adds to the value of your work anyway. Photographic work, it makes you a better artist if you're able to have that emotional space and gain some perspective. You can come back with even more ideas, more skills, more tenacity, and I think that can only make one a better artist. But yeah, so much there, so much great advice. And I think one overriding thing, just listening to you and what we can all really learn from you, is just try as much as you can. And you don't know what will happen, right? You don't know who you might meet. You don't know what skill you might pick up. You don't know what might stick or what you might find that you absolutely love, and that you might be able to pursue and find some meaning and, find some money in it, maybe not. But the more you put yourself out there, the more you're able to try things, the more chances you are of gonna, collaborate with the best people, or get your name out there, get your work out there, sell stuff, get some jobs, and the other side of it is also what you touched upon. And I hear a lot of, it's so many young artists or photographers these days, they live through Instagram, right? They live through social media. So they don't really see, I mean, they do, but less so, I think, than maybe the likes of you and me and the older generation, where they don't see still the avenues that you have out there that are actually in the physical world. Going out, networking, going to maybe clubs, and, going to exhibitions and galleries, and just meeting and networking and talking. And I think that's just a byproduct of the age we're in now. But tell me what you're, I'm going to try and kind of circle back and kind of round this off now, but tell me what your voice is now. And, I can see, and we're going to talk about kind of some of your projects in a minute, because I don't want to end this conversation without talking about some of your fantastic projects. But just, tell me what your voice is now and what that means to you, and whether that is really your definition of success these days.
Yeah, I mean, obviously all my work pretty much revolves around landscape and the environment. And, there has to be a strong reason why I start something. Actually, let me change that phrase. I think there has to be a strong reason why I see something through and do it over months and years. Because I think, be honest, I start things and I try things, and not everything sticks. And one of the things that I think is really important, and I would like to emphasize, is that thing that not everything is a success. Not everyone, you don't show the world all your mistakes, and especially with social media, you don't see that. And, when I was young, I would think up some great ideas for projects, and a lot of the time I would see reasons why they would fail before I would even actually go out and do them. And maybe, I wouldn't even go and try it because of that. So first of all, really big one for me is try stuff. Don't scrap it at the drawing board. Try it and push it and then decide whether it's got legs or not. And, there are things that you do that you come back to. Nothing is wasted. You have ideas, put it in a notebook. You have some prints that you didn't quite work, put it in a box, go back to it. So I think what I do is very process driven. So that is an example of me sort of continually trying some different approaches and different techniques, different ways of telling a story or bringing something to people. And I don't want to be doing exactly the same approach time after time after time. Creatively, I need those juices to be really kind of flowing on a new approach. And, obviously, there are things that I've done like melting negatives, and, using sort of water to dissolve prints, and just continually thinking about the way that, kind of natural elements can interact with the photographic journey. And that might be right at the beginning, it might be right at the end, but to me, it's weaving those things together in a meaningful way that is kind of engaging, and sort of just isn't purely a document of a landscape or something, or where something has happened, but has my kind of imprint, my interaction with the landscape and within the photographic process, where those two things together. So, one of the first things, I did through a grant was do some printing that involved using natural elements. So I used seaweed and incorporated that in a photographic developer, and did a series on some Agfa black and white paper, which I bought, which I still have a huge amount of actually up there, just over my head. And, that was when I photographed this eroded rock on a beach on the coast in Norfolk. And, using the seaweed from that landscape in the developer from the print was a way of connecting, the landscape to the image, not them being sort of separate. So, that's definitely a sort of a good example, but it's also I don't see that particular body of work or project as being finished. I kind of see it as an ongoing thing that I'm going to add to. So this rock is eroding over the years, and I've been back to photograph it this year, and it's changed. So it could actually be a 10 or a 15-year project where I show the changes over time. Yeah, so those are kind of examples.
And for people listening and watching, we'll, on the video, we'll put these photos up. But for people listening, it's on your website, right? The project is called Rock, and I think the image is also on your homepage, or one of the images is on your homepage. But yeah, really, really fascinating stuff.
Oh yeah, and coincidentally, just behind my head that you can't see at the moment, but you can see now, is a framed print of rock, and they're all completely unique, printed in slightly different ways. But yeah, as I was saying, I've still got some of the paper, amazing vintage Agfa paper, and I see that paper being used over the next 10 years, returning to this particular rock and photographing it as it changes and potentially disappears and has gone forever.
Wonderful. And, with it, all of your projects have these such unique and creative ways of either producing or displaying. Look at Hanging by a Thread, which used torched wood to, as a metaphor for the fires that happened. I can't remember the year, but the wildfires in the UK a few years back. Or 1,000 Degrees, where you're blowtorching paper or film, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think there was such visceral interest to that, and so many layers to the rhetoric behind it. But, I still ask the question, well, what's it all for? And does it even matter in terms of getting in front of the right people? Or do you not even care about that, whether this actually can inspire change or actually have an impact? Is it more of an internal and personal journey?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, I think as an artist, you have to do work that satisfies something within yourself. That has to be the starting point. There's no point kind of, especially, I'm talking about personal work, commercial work. It's, that comes from the outside and you meet halfway and you do something. But when it comes to personal work, it has to come first and foremost from here. And then you kind of introduce it to other people out into the world. And the further those ripples go, then great. But, I'm not using a natural metaphor. I'm not at that point in my life where if I create ripples, then great. But I'm not expecting a tsunami to happen straight away.
It's almost the opposite of photojournalism, where you are going to get the story first and foremost and create as much impact as possible. The actual kind of, I guess we can use the phrase fine art, but the kind of the fine art side of things doesn't matter. Whereas now you do it the other way around. It's like you want to make something in a fine art way that is of so much importance to yourself. And if it has an impact, or if it is seen, and if it does create ripples, then great, but that's not your number one intent.
No, it's not. And I don't think, I think artists, also I think when artists get involved with certain issues, and, there's sometimes a real pressure that artists are there to create change in some way.
Yeah.
And it's like, hang on, we're not campaigners. We're not politicians. What do you expect? What are you expecting us to do? We are showing a vision. We're perhaps showing a different angle, a different way of looking at things. And maybe those thoughts and ripples can percolate through into people's minds. But I think you have to see, most artwork in that respect, in the particular field that I might be working in, as a slow burner. I think it's totally unrealistic to say, hey, this is going to create change. And, there's something that I'm working on that's going to come out in the next 6 to 12 months, which is quite topical. And it might well get much, become more, have more eyes on it than any other work that I've done in this field before. But if it doesn't, it doesn't. It's not going to stop me doing what I do. And I think if you are trying to do something that looks different and feels different, it is tricky to, I was going to say get mass appeal. I'm not looking for mass appeal, but for it to find its way through does sometimes take time. And, another thing of advice I'll give to some creative people is be patient. Be patient with what you're trying to achieve. Be persistent, be committed, do all of those things, but there's this impatience in the world, and some of that comes through social media, some of that comes through peer pressure, some of that and that thing to be perfect straight away, to have a fully formed, finished article that people go wow at. It's unrealistic, just keep working, enjoy it, just keep working.
Yeah, I always think if it means, if you believe in it as much, we talked about this earlier, like if you really want to do it, right, you've got to ask yourself that question. You can answer it. If you can answer it yes, then almost everything else falls to the wayside. You got to believe in yourself that you'll find a way, and as long as be, like you said, persistent. Let's talk about patience of consistency and consistency of patience. Like just be patient, but be diligent. Like keep working hard. Things will come, and they'll come in a way that you never even thought they would. Right. So we have to be, and this kind of leads me on to the future and what you're going to be doing over the next few years and beyond. But more importantly, how you see this space and this photography space, on a professional level, but also on an art, on a personal artistic level. How do you see things in terms of your legacy and what you kind of want to leave as your body of work, or what you're currently working on, and how the photography world and industry is going to change, if at all, over the next few years and beyond?
Oh gosh, this could keep us going for a while.
We'll just have a podcast on just this question.
Yeah.
All right, you got 2 minutes. Go.
Okay, legacy. To be honest, that's not something that I particularly think of. I'm much more about being in the here and the now. What happens after I'm gone? Well, I can't affect that. So, who knows? And then you were asking about sort of how you see the photography industry, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing, speaking to a lot of my students and a lot of people, a lot of the audience, and everyone's so worried about AI, and especially people who are trying to go from potentially photography as a hobby to photography as a profession. And we've talked about this, so we don't have to kind of go over that ground again. But when it comes to looking at the photography industry as a job or as a career, as a professional art form, where do you see things going? Do you think it would just be shrinking generally, and we'll kind of forget about some parts of the photography world, or do you see photography generally being more of a valuable commodity or valuable skill to do? And how do you where do you see photography being placed in the AI world, essentially?
I mean, I think, sort of from my experience in my career, and it's just a sort of continuation, whether it's, the change from film to digital, and then now sort of AI coming in, the rise in social media. There's always been these various impacts along the way, and you sort of have to understand where the next sort of step is going and where you might fit in. But I mean, generally, I do see a sort of this kind of chasm opening up, where that sort of middle area where there used to be work has sort of disappeared, and there's either imagery in a sort of broader sense, it either being in a very kind of exclusive, high level, original artwork way, or being something that is incredibly sort of shareable and sort of commercial and for the masses as well. I mean, I guess there's certain things that kind of spring to mind as where it might go. I think sort of live experiences are a thing that are something that can develop, and I think whether that's sort of anything from in-person workshops to certain things online, but to feel where you're a part of something and involved with something. In the commercial world, that is a very big thing. And I think, we're, we are sociable beings, we need that interaction. And finding a way to sort of share and be part of something is always going to be there. So if you can be involved and be part of something in some way, I think that's really important. I think it's a challenging thing to be a sort of a solo photographer delivering things. I think that sort of image and profile has kind of gone to a certain extent. I think collaboration is always going to be a big thing. And then at the other extreme, doing something that is incredibly, unique as well. But that real kind of splintering of the kind of photography world has been happening and will kind of continue to happen. But yeah.
Well, like you said, it's been happening anyway, even 20 years ago or 25 years ago when the rise of digital photography, and you even, inferred that with what you were talking about earlier in terms of shrinking budgets. That was just a way for the market to tell us that, oh yeah, this area of the photography industry is shrinking. And like you said, it's likely just going to disappear altogether, but let's see. Well, Ed, look, it's been a pleasure. I say this to a lot of guests, but especially with you, I could talk to you for hours and listen to your wonderful takes on things and stories. And I'll keep a close eye on your work. Do we have any exhibitions coming up or anything that we can watch out for on your end?
Yeah, there will be some things coming up, but in a strange way, I've kind of had a little bit of a kind of over this summer, a bit of a step back and a bit of a break. So I'm kind of raring to go again in September, and there are some things coming up. But follow me on Instagram at Ed Sykes, and you'll see what the next things are. Yeah, where the ripples kind of go.
Yeah. Maybe I'm one of those ripples, but thanks so much for taking part.
No, and thank you, Matt. You've been a great, generous host. And at some stage, our paths will cross again.
I really hope they do. And thanks for your patience for those watching and listening. We had quite a few technical issues today, so we've had to be patient, and I want to thank you for that as well. So until next time, Ed, take good care of yourself, and hopefully our paths will cross at some point in the future.
Indeed. All right, Matt. Take care.
Oh, that was a lot of technical issues. A lot of technical issues.